thanks for making time to join us for this second seminar. I will just introduce the project a little bit, and then I will hand over to Aisha Phoenix to continue with the presentation. My name is Onesmus Mwabonje. I'm a co-I on this project. The project focuses on applied African science fiction and how it can be used for pedagogical approaches here at Imperial, but also with our African collaborator, particularly University of Nairobi. I think today we are joined by a team from University of Nairobi, but we also have people from the African Speculative Society as well joining us. We also have a team from Strathmore University who are also joining us for this seminar. We've got a series of seminars that we have arranged, monthly seminars, which will cover various inputs for on the topic. But we also have small group seminars. We've just finished with ours here at Imperial, and we will be providing support to the University of Nairobi students on the same. We also, part of the output of the project is to make sure that we have a tool that can be used for teaching in the participating universities, but also can be borrowed across the African higher education institutions as well. So today we are happy to have Dr. Aisha Phoenix joining us to talk about exploring the politics of international research through speculative fiction. Dr. Phoenix is a lecturer in social justice at King's College London. She's also a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, researching on understanding colorism among young people in the UK. Her research interest focuses primarily on racialized identities and belonging, and issues related to social justice, including colorism and anti-Muslim racism. She's also a co-author of Islam on Campus, Contested Identities and the Cultures of Higher Education in Britain. She's also a speculative fiction writer, and she will talk a bit more about that in her presentation today. And she has published a number of stories in this space. So I will now hand over to Dr. Phoenix to take it from here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Just if you can't hear, please do let Paulina know so that I can adjust the volume for you. It's good? Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to begin by just outlining what I'm going to cover in today's talk, starting with learning outcomes, then thinking about speculative fiction and how it has a history of racism and exclusions, and then think about the ways in which speculative fiction has been used for social justice. And then I'll introduce the collection Glimpse, and then the story I have in the collection, which is called Bat Monkey. I'll talk about the inspiration for the story, what the objectives were in writing the story. Then we'll move on to thinking about the politics of international research and thinking particularly about ethical issues with international research, centering around the idea of power imbalances, hierarchies and power relations, conflicting research agendas, issues to do with ethics, and then how can things be different? How can things improve? And then we'll open up for a Q&A at the end. So in terms of the learning outcomes, by the end of the talk, you have insights into speculative fiction as a genre in relation to how it addresses issues to do with social justice. You'll know how to draw out social justice themes from speculative fiction. Now, of course, you may well already didn't know that, but that's one of the outcomes. Be aware of ethical issues in international research and have an understanding of how to approach ethical international research. So thinking first about speculative fiction and racisms and exclusions, speculative fiction has a long history of being patriarchal, imperialistic and racist. Kelly argues that it's harmed women and minoritized ethnic people, and Burnett would suggest that white authors largely ignore race or racialization and particularly black people's needs, lives and cultures. And when race is included, minoritized ethnic people are often represented by aliens, which is othering. And I've read some collections, multi-book collections by very famous speculative fiction authors who do have aliens, which are depicted with tropes that you associate, for example, with black people. But they're all things about being hypersexual, being very, very negative. So it's not just that it's very dehumanizing often, the depictions of black people in speculative fiction. So there's also marginalization of black writers within speculative fiction. In 2021, 7.5% of 2,657 stories published in the US were by black writers, but the black US population is 13.6%. So it shows there's an underrepresentation of black speculative fiction writers getting their stories published. So the science fiction and fantasy community has a problem with race, according to Justina Ireland. More specifically, SFF publishing as a whole is and continues to be anti-black. And Flood would argue that although you have some very, very successful African and black authors who've done very well in the speculative space, it doesn't mean that there's not still racism within the genre. Now, having said all that, speculative fiction is also a very exciting genre to be able to challenge issues to do with racism and other prejudices. It gives activists the space to imagine possibilities and challenge the status quo. Particularly because you're not focused on reality, you can imagine whatever you like. And also you have authors who imagine dystopias, things that you would rather avoid. Speculative fiction facilitates playing with different outcomes and strategies before having to deal with real-world costs, according to Brown. So Samuel would argue that speculative fiction can serve as a space for marginalized people to imagine a future or alternative space away from oppression, or to imagine the worst, to think about what could be if current inequalities and injustices are allowed to continue. So speculation is a valuable method of imagining alternative possible futures. So thinking about how speculative fiction operates in terms of social justice, I think this is Samuel, has come up with 4 key areas in which there are interventions. So black speculative fiction writers often explicitly explore and theorize race or racialization. Often and explicitly, they explore resistance to hegemonic power and white supremacy and misogyny. Most of the time, black characters or characters of color are present, and queerness and non-heteronormative sexuality is at the front and center of much of black speculative fiction work. So now I'd like to move on to introducing this collection by People Tree Press called Glimpse. It's an anthology of Black British speculative fiction edited by Leonie Ross, who's a really successful and wonderful writer. So in terms of my story, Bat Monkey, it explores the journey of a character called Miles, who is a Black British Nigerian scholar who becomes aware of the ethical issues related to conducting international research in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm just going to read, to set the scene, just read from the opening of the story. The camp was alive with cricket song when I arrived. It was dark and the air was heavy, as though it wouldn't hold back the rain for long. Kahindo, the local conservationist, greeted me with an energetic handshake and a big smile. Welcome, Mr. Miles, welcome. Then one of the porters led me down the muddy track to my hut. I pulled the clothes from my backpack, damp and musty from crossing the swamp, and hung them on the chair. All except the shirts Amma had snuck into my bag. They reminded me too much of how she'd cried when I said I had to join the others, of how she'd retreated into silence. So thinking about the inspiration for the story, I was thinking a lot about this recently because I wrote the story quite a long time ago. I was thinking back to when I wrote it, and I think it was definitely inspired by studying for an MA in social research, a topic on race, politics and ethics, and thinking about the ways in which black people have been dehumanized and the animalization of black people, and wanting to explore and disrupt that. So Goff Haslam argues that dehumanization is not seeing others as fully human and not attributing to them certain qualities associated with humans, such as morality, rationality, or self-control. And so the back of my mind when I was writing the story was those ideas around racist constructions of black people and how black people are often dehumanized, and wanting to play with that through this speculative story. Goff and et al. Argue that people who are dehumanized are not afforded fair treatment, compassion or protection, and so causing them harm is considered acceptable and justified. And again, that's a theme that underlies this story as well. Dehumanization includes denying that those victimized can feel pain and emotional pain, which contributes to harsher treatment, and it can take the form of animalization, whereby people are likened to animals. And we've seen so many examples in UK society over the last few years of dehumanization and animalization of black people. If you think about the birth of Harry and Meghan's baby, and one commentator who tweeted a picture of a person with a gorilla or something, or monkey walking out and saying, "Welcome back from the hospital." So there have been constantly these kind of dehumanizing, animalizing narratives in UK popular culture. And if you think about football matches, how often black people are likened to monkeys or gorillas when they when they don't make penalties, etc. Black people are depicted and compared to primates or perceived to have animalistic tendencies. And they've been dehumanized to animalistic dehumanization since at least the 16th century, and that's closely tied to colonization and slavery. So another of the inspirations for the story was, when I was younger, I wanted to work in development, so I did a master's at SOAS in anthropology of development, which actually rather put me off. But one of the issues that was constantly raised was the idea of scholars and professionals from the global north causing unintended harm when in the global south, despite sometimes having the best intentions. And often that was to do with not understanding the context that they were going into. Sometimes it's also due to unethical practices. And so again, that was underlying this story as I was writing it. So what I'm seeking to do through the story, although it wasn't as conscious as that's not how I write, but I think thinking about what the story was doing, I was trying to challenge and problematize negative constructions of black people and problematic constructions of black African scholars and specialists in sub-Saharan Africa. I was also kind of challenging or highlighting issues with the ethics of international research and the power dynamics between global north and global south researchers. So if we now think about exploring some of these ethical issues, one of the key issues is power imbalances, which Guerin writes about, and the term called parachute research, which many of you might know about, when well-funded researchers in the global north conduct research in global south countries, often neglecting to draw on significant local expertise. So with an idea that almost we know better, so we don't need to ask the locals. This is something that's very clear in Bat Monkey, because you've got a US and UK research team traveling to an unspecified sub-Saharan African country. The team is led by a character called Chase, who is a white American man, and they do not treat the lead local conservationist as an expert. They treat him rather like a low-status tour guide, so he's just there to show them around. They don't care about what he might know or how well educated he is. Parachute research is a significant issue in the geosciences, just to give one example. Some 3,500 high-impact geoscience articles are published annually. About 3.9% of them relate to an area in Africa, but less than a third of these had an African researcher as an author, just to show some of those imbalances. Another issue is to do with funding and the issue that money raises in terms of what research is allowed and who has the power to do the research, who's invited in, the dynamics that are set up. So many institutions or individuals in the Global South need funding and the prestige that comes with international partnerships, and therefore they might take whatever comes along, as opposed to being able to be discerning about who they want to work with and the kind of projects they want to work with, when in fact what is needed is reciprocal projects which are mutually beneficial, rather than Global South imposing kind of aims on Global North opposing aims on Global South countries. So in this story, at one point, Kahindo, who's the local conservationist, says, so I haven't said what the story is about. So for many of you who won't have read the story is about this research team going to an unspecified country in sub-Saharan Africa to look for flying monkeys. So that's their main aim, and they're really excited at this prospect of finding that and how that will give them this status as being world leaders and new species named after them, etc. And so they've gone there, they have all these ideas about what they want to achieve. The local people have a very different idea. They don't want to, although they've invited the team in, it's due to funding issues and not to do with wanting to support that endeavour. And so Kahindo, the local conservationist, says, there are no flying monkeys. And so Miles, the protagonist, glares at him, so what the hell? We needed the money. Without guards and bribes, the poachers would destroy everything. I won't let that happen, Kahindo said. So it just underlies the idea that it's not just a simple fact of wanting to bring researchers in. Sometimes there are compromises made or difficult negotiations due to the fact that funding is required and there's a lack of funding, which means you might have to have a relationship with a team that you might not otherwise want to work with. So Gilardi talks about issues to do with fossils in Brazil. And although there are laws that prevent the sale of fossils in Brazil, they get illegally trafficked. And for some local indigenous people, those fossils are from another dimension, so they're sacred. And when researchers remove them, the social and cultural context gets harmed. So it's really significant, but they're not understood by those people who come in and take away in an extractive way. Gilardi argues that about 90%, again, similar to the research I mentioned before, 90% of research published about fossils from Brazil in the last 30 years the fossils were housed in foreign institutions. Nearly 60% of the 71 publications between 1990 and 2020 on Cretaceous macrofossils from this particular region, the Araripe Basin, were led by foreign researchers, and more than half of foreign-led publications did not collaborate with local researchers. So it's, again, this idea of foreigners coming in, taking what they want, not engaging with local people, not recognizing local expertise or local needs and expectations. So just as some local indigenous Brazilian people believe fossils are from another dimension, in Bat Monkey, Kahindo and the local community believe the living beings Chase and his team are searching for are not monkeys. Now, I don't think in the story it's ever specified what they are. That's for the reader to to think about what these creatures could actually be, but they're definitely not primates. So Kahindo says, it's not a joke, they fly, but they're not monkeys. This is Miles speaking. I stared at him, waiting for him to continue. Our ancient ancestors, it sounded like the start of a tall tale. I couldn't believe I'd been drawn in. All along, he'd been peddling folklore. So you can see he doesn't even let Kahindo explain what those creatures are in terms of that local context, what those creatures mean to them, how they understand them. He just decides that this is just pointless folklore that's kind of not worth listening to, and he doesn't engage anymore. So thinking about hierarchies in Bat Monkey, that's something that comes throughout the story. And I've just highlighted different colours to show the status of different characters. So over fufu and vegetable stew, Kahindo thanked us for choosing his research station. He said they were honoured to have us, how our project would help them to continue their conservation work and pay for the guards that protected the centre and wildlife. Chase sat back in his chair with one arm resting on the top of it and smiled as though he were king. So you've got one kind of regal person who's got a sense of himself as really greatly important, and the other, that's the Chase, who's the lead, the PI of the project. And on the other hand, you've got Kahindo, the local conservationist, saying, we're honoured to have you, so it's much more. So you can see the hierarchical relationship there. Kahindo frowned. That's not it, he said, shaking his head. He pulled out his phone and tried to show us his clip again, but we were focused on the new footage. So this is a point in the story where they found one of these creatures that they're hunting for, and Kahindo's determined that to make them believe that this is not what they've been looking for. But Chase ignores him. We need to trap one. And then this is another colleague who's from an international community. She says, we should study them in their natural habitat first. Kahindo kept saying that what we'd filmed was definitely not a flying monkey, but Chase ignored him. It's my grant, we're going to catch one. So he's pulling rank and showing his importance and that they'll do what he says they'll do. So I've just designed this so you can see the hierarchies here. I think it's very clear. So at the top you've got Chase, and then you've got Pretty and Miles. They're all foreign and they're high status. And then you've got Kahindo, the local conservationist team leader, the Christian, the local conservationist, and Joseph, another local conservationist, and beneath them guards and porters. So they're all local and they're all lower status. And then if you think about the racialization, Chase is the white PI, Pretty is Asian, Miles is black, and then Kahindo and the rest of the team are all black as well. So you've got the racialized hierarchies as well as the international versus local hierarchies. So it's important to take an intersectional approach considering gender, ethnicity, nationality and class. Chase, a white US man, is at the top of the hierarchy. As a man, Miles would be next, but as a black man, he's below Pretty, whom Chase fancies. And Miles's inclusion in the project feels tokenistic, so although he's there as the black face, the black man to help smooth things over with the locals rather than respected as a equal in that research dynamic. The black male local conservationists and other workers are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And one of the issues in the story is that the characters have conflicting research agendas. So Chase's research agenda is to come to this country, capture a bat monkey, prove that flight evolved twice, and then he'll be famous. He's very keen to tell everyone that he's going to have a new species named after him. So he's really excited at that prospect. In contrast, Kahindo, his aims are to understand, conserve and protect local wildlife and sacred living beings, and for that he requires money. So he's focused on getting the money in order to do that work, which he's committed to. But there's another agenda, which is to keep the most precious knowledge local rather than letting foreigners get to it. That's why he was saying there is no bat monkey, because he doesn't want the foreign team to understand what they do, what the richness that they do have, because he doesn't want it to be extractive in that sense. And his other aim is to prevent international scholars being extractive and exploitative. So those two different research agendas conflict. And that's something that kept coming up when I was studying anthropology of development, the idea that you might have a name and the foreign team might have a name. The local team, the foreign team have aims, but those aims might not ever be possible to both be met because they're directly in opposition. And it's not always clear at the beginning of projects that that's the case. So Miles says about the bat monkey that they did capture, it's only young. I think we should, don't get sentimental on me. This is life-changing, snapped Chase, picking up the cage. Chase put the cage on the table and we surrounded it. We're not going to harm you, Chase said, plucking it from the cage to measure, weigh and tag it. Kahindo looked like he was at a funeral. He held himself stiffly, his face tense. He glanced at me with reddened eyes. I could feel his guilt. So that just really illustrates that conflict in terms of research agenda. So Chase is delighted. This is the moment he's been longing for his whole career. Whereas for Kahindo, it's like a funeral, like someone's died in the family, that kind of weighty, really awful moment as he thinks about what's about to happen. So thinking about the ethics, it's so interesting to think about when you think about ethics for whom? So from Chase's perspective, I'll just read this extract and then we'll think about Chase's perspective when we think about ethical research versus Kahindo's. In the early hours, long after the others had gone to bed, I went back to look at the creature in its small prison. Thank God, Chase said when I entered the room. I came to check on my bat monkey and Kahindo was in here. He had the window and the cage door open. Something's not right with him, I said. Chase yawned. Are you all right to guard it for a few hours? I don't trust the locals. So you get a sense of his hierarchical sense. He feels that they're inferior. These local people are inferior. They're problematic. They're not doing the job that they're meant to be doing. For him, the ethical research is to make sure that that creature they've captured is kept contained and imprisoned, and that they can do whatever research they want to do on it, probably take it with them, get famous through that. In contrast, Kahindo's trying to free the creature, because he doesn't want them to be extractive in that way, and he doesn't think that that sacred creature should be in a cage. So it just shows, again, illustrates that conflicting agendas at play. So thinking now about how things can be better. So in terms of improving collaborations between the global north and the global south, one of the important things is to have reciprocal, mutually beneficial engagements. So recognising that if you're going to have a research project, it's not only going to benefit the country where the funding's coming from, but also the country where the research is being conducted. That's very important. Also, developing research proposals together. So rather than having a wonderful idea and then imposing it on the country that you want to do the research in, it's working with partners in different countries to develop the research proposals that meet the agendas of different geographical regions, and then submitting them together. Also, it's important to ensure that proposals serve the needs of all the countries involved, which I've just mentioned. And one of the things that can be very helpful is research in both directions. So not just global north to global south, but also global south to global north, because it's interesting when people go and do the research in other countries, how you can find things peculiar and alien and write about local customs as if you're superior to them. It's interesting to then see how you would feel about having your practices, which might be equally strange, but normal to you, written about by people for whom it isn't normal to do things in a particular way, or queue the way that British people queue, for example. It's also important to be aware of and discuss the colonial legacies of research and the dynamics of that as well. And researchers in the global north should share resources with partners in the global south so that it's not one-sided. I think I was reading some articles where there were access to resources that were required in order to publish that couldn't be afforded by scholars in the global south, which means that they're then constantly at a disadvantage in terms of the academic arena. So that's also important. Raman argues about the importance of prioritising values-based research, and the key principles of which are thinking about being humble, there's humility, scholars thinking beyond themselves and recognising their relationships in the networks they are part of, and being accountable to those people that they're in the networks with, rather than just acting out of their own interests, and also thinking about the collectivity. So scholars should recognise that no individual is more important than the collective. It's also arguably important to have feminist approaches to research and anti-colonial approaches as well. So Raman would argue that it's important to identify where colonialism is absolutely happening in your discipline and then try to address it. And it's really hard to see the ground when you're already standing on it. So it can be difficult to problematize what's going on in your own region. And again, inverting the research relationship, so global south, scholars from the global south do research in the global north, could help with that, because there will be things that perhaps scholars from the global south will see that are taken for granted in the global north. Other principles which are valuable are prepare well, so work to understand the local community and its needs, and do that in conjunction with the local community rather than a top-down, we know what you need and we're going to give it to you type of approach. Ensure that any skills and research that you're planning is going to be valuable to a local community. And again, the way to do that is to work with the communities that you're engaging with rather than imposing that knowledge on them. Respect other forms of knowledge local people may have, and I think that can be quite an issue. Anthropology of development literature would suggest it is often quite an issue, but it's important. Hire local people and remunerate them well. That's also important, because sometimes all the money comes in terms of paying for people who've been brought from a particular country to do the work. The money goes back to the country they came from, and then they leave. Adopt an ethical approach to ownership when drawing on data from indigenous lands. If data is taken from a local community, give it back and do so in a timely manner. So because we don't have the video, we finished a little bit earlier, but I'd like to open for some questions now, or reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Aisha for that eye-opening presentation about the topic. And we'll open the floor now for questions, both online and for those who are in the room. Any questions?
So I'm very interested in the idea of co-produced...
Yes, wait 1 second, because I'm not sure people online will hear your question. Oh, sorry.
I'm very interested, sorry, Tilly Collins in the Centre for Environmental Policy here. I'm very interested in the idea of the co-produced research, and some of the challenges with that are very different knowledge bases, of course. But one of the really big challenges is how on earth do you get funding for it, given the extended development times of being able to put together, properly co-developed research projects?
And that's a really good question. I think that it would be, though, worth having funding pots specifically for that purpose. I think that if they don't exist already, I think different institutions, different disciplines will have different funding pots available. But I think if they don't exist already, that's something to lobby for, having the funding to develop those international research projects, which are particularly thinking about ethical practices, so that then so it's not tokenistic. And I'll just give an example. I won't say the institution, but someone approached me last week at Thursday, and it was at maybe 4:30 p.m. They sent me an email. We are thinking of doing something. We need EDI. The deadline is tomorrow at 1. Would you like to do it? And I was like, oh. So time is really important. It's really important to have the time to do it properly, not in a tokenistic way, not in a last minute way, but to think about this from the beginning and develop it properly. And you're right, that time costs money. I think often academics are not funded for most of the things they do, but doesn't mean that they shouldn't be. So I think there should be pots of money deliberately designed to help even the playing field by allowing extra time to work on projects and make sure they're robust, and that they do, the negotiations could take longer because you're having to, as you say, come from different disciplinary backgrounds, local knowledge, etc. But it's worth it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anything online? I've got a question.
No? Yeah, no, go. Yeah.
So thank you. I enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed reading the story as well. You painted Chase quite starkly in the caricature you used, and that reminded me somewhat of what Ursula Le Guin did in The Dispossessed, where you had some really quite stark distinctions between the two ways of operating. She never resolved the situation. Do you think there's any resolution, any practical resolution, or do you think the whites will always go on being whites and the indigenous will always go on being indigenous in anything other than a non-practical way?
Oh, I don't see the world like that. This character is deliberately designed to represent a certain type of person.
Yes.
But I don't see that, I mean, there are many, many, many wonderful scholars of all ethnicities, including white scholars, that I'm proud to have as colleagues, friends, family members. So I don't think there's a problem of white scholarship, but there is a problem, and it's not just white people, because when Miles goes into that research space, I think he's very problematic, and he's a black African Nigerian, maybe UK born, but a Nigerian man, and that's not because of his racialization, but it's like the politics you espouse. And I think it's that which can be harder to challenge. Like we've got the point now in the UK where you have the first black conservative leader, and her politics are very different from my politics. But so it's not about our racialization, but they are kind of almost diametrically opposed. So I think it can be very hard if people have got very entrenched views about how things should be to challenge those. And that's where the issues lie. But I wouldn't divide it along racialized lines, although I know that Chase is white in this example. But I think if you think about the funding inequities and inequities in higher education, both here and in the United States, the fact he's a white character is representative of the fact he's more likely to be a white PI. Is that asked? I don't know if that's answering.
Yes, and I apologise. I asked a sort of slightly clumsy question there, and maybe I can re-ask it. Do you see that the ideological distinctions between the two ways of operating can be resolved?
Right. Well, in this story, no, and that's because they are literally trying to do completely different things, and they see the world from in completely different ways. And the respect that would be required in order for Chase and leading a team to go into that context and be able to listen and hear what's happening on the local level is not there. And if that's not there, then I don't see any possibility of a positive outcome. With the different research team going in, they could be perhaps invited to hear a bit more about the local context. Maybe if they'd earned Kahindo's trust, like Miles had the chance to, but didn't really open up to that. He had an opportunity though to be let into something very exciting, but he was closed to it. A different team, however they're racialized, who are open and ethical in their approach and worked with Kahindo, the outcome might have been very different, but they wouldn't have got a new species named after themselves and got to publish it and then have a successful grant, which is going against everything that those funders are expecting from the research team. So you'd be failing. In order for the research to be a success, it would have to be a failure, if that makes sense.
That's really fascinating.
Hi, thank you. I just have a question. What role do you think that AI might have or could have, or maybe if any role, in improving or changing Global North and Global South collaboration?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Do you want to say what kind of AI you're thinking of?
Maybe that could, I don't know, I'm not an AI expert at all. I'm doing a PhD in biodesign engineering, very not AI at all, but in environmental science. Anyway, no, I'm just asking in the sense of maybe like when it comes to funding and like allocating funding and knowing how to, I don't know if it has any kind of like choice role.
I think the possibilities for AI are endless, so it's a really fascinating thing to think about and think through. One of the issues at the moment with AI is the fact that humans have an impact on how AI is developed, and the biases that those humans bring have an impact on AI being potentially biased. As one mentioned, I write about colorism. That's my primary research area at the moment, and I was doing a keynote at a conference earlier in the year where there was someone who presented on AI and colorism in AI. Because if you've got people training AI to recognize certain faces, but in ways where you've got bias in the way in which you're doing that, then the way in which the AI can recognize faces is also biased. The prejudices, the colorism, the racism inherent in that, even sexism inherent in that, is then is adopted and embraced by the AI. So I think it depends on how AI develops, how useful it could be in this particular kind of context. Because if you just reproduce biases that we already have, then that's deeply problematic.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we have a question from online. Somebody is asking a question. Love the talk, he says, that's team. I'm wondering how these research recommendations might best be implemented. Would they be most effective through government policy initiative, NGO involvement, or community-based approaches?
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to think about that for a minute before I answer that.
Do you want the second question?
Okay.
Yeah, so the second question comes from Christine. What did the format of speculative fiction capture that a regular academic paper or blog post could not?
Okay, I'll take the second question first, and then I'll do the first question. So in terms of what did speculative fiction allow me to do that a regular academic article or blog post could not? There are many things. One key one is people read it. I think more people have heard and read this story than would have read an article had I written it. So that's one thing. And also not maybe just numbers, but a different audience. You're reaching a different audience through a speculative work than you might reach with an academic paper, which can be quite exclusionary in its own way. But also, because I don't have to be tied to reality in any particular way, because as far as I'm aware, and I don't know everything, there are no flying. I'm not going to say what the creatures are because you can make up your own mind about that, but they don't, as far as I'm aware, exist. But they can in my story. So the possibilities are limitless, and you can challenge and provoke in ways that academic writing can be quite restrictive, I find. So I think it provides a number of opportunities and possibilities. But obviously, the academic work, which I do most of my daily life is spent doing academic work, I think is really important too. So they can work in tandem. But I think reaching different audiences, having freedoms which you don't necessarily have with academic writing are benefits of being able to write in speculative ways. And so in terms of the first question, thinking about how to approach improving these collaborations, I can't remember the full list, whether it was government, NGOs, community-based approaches, I think it would be ideal for a mixture of all of those, rather than it just being one approach. I think that the most effective way, because NGOs can have a powerful impact in showing how things can be done when it's done well, and I think governments can set policies and can offer funding and support as well So I think if you combine different approaches, that would be very beneficial, because it's not something that it's not something can be easily done.
Maybe specifically like funders. Do you think funders have a lot of power to influence or require things in terms of proposals? Yeah, is there an improvement on the kind of the ethics review that we have currently, etc.?
Yeah, I've done some reviews of funding for projects that would fit within this space, and I think their funders have a lot of power, and I think that's a really good idea, because you can be quite prescriptive in terms of what you stipulate, and I think that could make a difference, because it wouldn't necessarily be someone writing at 4:30 in the afternoon saying I need something by 1, but if the whole model is based around being inclusive and working in a meaningful way, then that could lead to change, because people want money always. Academics always want money, and they'll bend over and do jump through hoops to get it. If this became something important, then people would respect it more and put more effort into it. So I think that is a key area. It won't be easy to do, but not because there's not a funded commitment, but because how would you write it? What would you stipulate that academics have to do in order for it to be meaningful in ways that people can't just kind of, rubber, So to do it effectively will be difficult, but I think that is a good starting point.
Yeah, so maybe I would ask one as well. It's about the dynamics of leadership, the way you put it in hierarchy terms, the white versus black. But my question is, those dynamics really also do play on the ground. So if you look at a country in Africa, you will have a similar sort of issues, not related by race, but going down into the tribal lines. But what can they do? What can the Africans do? Going to the heart of the story, what can they do in order to mitigate these circumstances around funding, around being able to collaborate more fully in research projects? What can they do given the local dynamics and also the dynamics that the story brings from the white-black divide?
Okay, so I imagine you probably have more insights into this than I do, but one of the issues is that what is the politics of the government in the particular country. Now that will vary very significantly from country to country, the politics of the particular government, but also the strength of that government in terms of how much is it dependent on international aid, international support. That will also determine how confident they can be in terms of pushing back against research practices that they don't like, because it's not an equal playing field in any sense. So, because you could argue that a government in a sub-Saharan African country could say, we don't give you permission to come to do this research unless you meet these conditions. But depends, just like Kahindo needed that money, it depends on how free would that government or local authority or whoever is making that decision be to say no to a rich country's rich funding body. You can't do this unless X, Y, Z. So the power dynamics mean that I think it's very challenging. Because in an ideal world, you say, they just say you can't do the research unless you meet our requirements. We want to be partners. We want this. We want an equal say. Is that idealistic or is that realistic? And it's a negotiation and it's difficult. But I'd love to hear your insights as well. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So I think for a country like Kenya, for example, they've come up with a body that sort of regulate who comes in to do research. And the benefit that participating researchers locally can also benefit in terms of papers or report, being involved in report writing as well. So that's sort of one thing that the Kenyans are sort of working in order to help the situation. I don't know whether Professor Mburu is online to give more insights on that. So, Prof, would you mind unmuting and speaking about Nakotse?
Yeah, okay, I was I was not ready to comment on that.
If you have a question also, you can ask.
Yeah. NACOST is the body. NACOST stands for National Commission for Science and Technology, and it's the body that is mandated to give permits for research in Kenya, and also actually to fund research. So we find that people coming from outside and the country, and even specific organizations, except the public ones, are required to get permit to do research. However, I find like the universities and the research organizations which are registered with the government, because their mandate is to do research, then they don't need permits. And a lot of the work that I do, I rarely go there for permit, except when we have got international organizations or people coming from outside the country are involved. Yeah. So for us, it's good, but also sometimes can delay the work, and because sometimes they are slow. Although nowadays they have really improved, because the last time I applied for a permit, it took only about 4 days. And that was really fast according to Kenyan standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Mbaro. Did you have a question to ask? Did you have a question, Professor Mbaro, to ask?
No, me, I don't have any question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's down to my personal interests here. I'm very interested by eating insects, and I've always wanted to have a project, and I've applied for money a number of times for this and never been successful, that collects the language associated with eating insects, the names for the insects, the recipes for insects, across a broad swathe of West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about the research that interests the country, this is a very, very low priority in the country. It's seen as, looking backwards, it's seen as food of the poor, it's very, very poorly seen from an African research point of view. So it sort of sits in my faintly romantic notion that this is an important thing to consider. How do you marry the real differences in aspiration of research to being able to somehow conserve a socio-cultural context that may be evaporating?
They made me think about that particular topic, because I think the question's broader, but
Yeah.
thinking about eating insects, would there be potential for getting excitement into that by looking at the monetization of eating insects in this country? I remember my mother kindly decided to buy a cricket bar for me and my daughter at one point, which we then had to eat, and it was something that was I thought it was going to become popular to see more of these kind of bars, of insect bars in this country. I haven't seen many myself, actually.
Well, unfortunately, we Brexited and all the regulations that allowed us to eat them.
I see, maybe that's what it is. But if you think about the efforts to monetize those things in the global north, if you included that into a proposal, would that change the way in which it's seen in the context in the countries that you're interested in exploring? So are there ways of reshaping, reformulating the work that incorporate your interests, so you get to do what you want to do, but also make it of interest to those in the country that you're keen to do that research?
So your tip is to monetize or provide an output for research that will make it more interesting later?
No, as in to show that there's potential money, because you think about those companies that are making bars of chocolate bars with crickets in are planning they're seeking to make money through this, something which you're saying is seen as low status there.
Yes.
So it's framed very differently in terms of people trying to, with their startups or whatever they're doing, trying to make money from those things here and selling them as a niche product, probably quite expensive, which not for poor people to eat. I'm not sure many poor people in this country are running around trying to find insects.
Yeah.
So if you reframe it and show how there's excitement about it from that perspective amongst some people here, and then you're wanting to look at what's already been done there, would that mean that in the local context people are seeing it differently rather than you going in there to look at something which is only seen as low status? Because you're saying it's seen as important amongst people here as well. Do you see what I mean? It's reframing the way in which it's looked at, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, it used to be something of incredibly high status. It's very, very important in maternal nutrition. But the flip to vertebrate meat
Right.
is, you know, is a kind of developmental pathway down which one might not want to go. But again, that's very judgy. But anyway, thank you very, very much. I'm really sorry I've got to...
You have got to, yes, it'll be very late now. But thanks so much for staying. It was really great to hear your questions.
Any more questions? Any questions on
Oh, there's one question
there's
here.
a question
Hi, I just wanted to ask if you have any positive examples of, you think, like, global north, global south collaborations that you think have gone really well or have had this reciprocal relationship?
That is a brilliant question. I think if you'd asked me that 10 years ago when I more recently looked at this, I would probably have a better sense. But now, because it's not something I'm looking at on my day-to-day work, I can't off the top of my head think of some, but I'm sure that there are many. And it would be nice if I get to do this lecture again to come armed with examples. I think it's a really good thing to not only critique, but also say this is exemplary and we can learn from this. I think that's a really, really valuable question.
So, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. We've learned quite a lot, particularly around the ethical dilemma that we have doing research between the global north and the global south. So thank you very, very much for coming, and hopefully when we run a similar thing in future, you will be able to come and give another seminar.
It'll be a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.